So I'll start immediately. I just want to make two very general points before lunch. First, that in my talk, I have no other choice but to generalize and to, let's say, to propose you some conceptual understanding of what is going on in these three countries. And of course, generalizations are always dangerous and inevitable at the same time, at least in our SCORM educational activity. And second, of course, we should remember that Soviet experiences or communist experiences, they were not and they are not homogeneous. They're very much ambivalent and rich in themselves. But in order to, let's say, to shorten this introduction, I'll use this notion. Without this all the time stressing of its ambivalence and contradictions. But you should keep it in mind that Soviet experience in both Russia, Poland, and Ukraine, of course, was very much diverse. That goes without saying. Now, why I have decided to choose these three countries for analysis? I think that one of the reasons, at least one of the reasons, is that their politics of history, all those politics, they are at least to some extent interrelated. It means that quite often Russian politics need to react on some Ukrainian initiatives or Polish initiatives and vice versa. That's very important. And second, I would say that what is similar, at least in terms of typology, between those three cases, is, let's say, the nature of their post-communist transformation. What do I mean? I mean that in all three countries, this transformation, this transit, so to say, was a kind of a compromise between part of the communist elites and part of the opposition. And this notion compromise is a kind of a key word, key notion in this respect. And I would even dare to say more that especially in the Russian and Ukrainian case, the whole transformation process was led and even introduced by ex-communist elites, not by the opposition. And that's very important to keep in mind during our further analysis. And what is different, very much different in these three cases, is of course the nature of Soviet experience. And I'm going to give you a very brief description of this difference. So we'll start from Poland. Poland, of course, was one of the countries of so-called external empire. So it was not a part of the Soviet Union, it was a part of the socialist bloc, Warsaw Pact, and so on. And due to this fact, of course, communist Poland was at least more or less independent from direct influence from Moscow. And there is kind of a consensus among historians that the period of more or less pure totalitarianism has come to an end in Poland after Stalin's death. So only in the time of Stalin's rule, so till 1953, you could find this example of direct and strict repressions in Polish society. If you look at Poland in 1970s, 1980s, we will see that the scale and power of opposition movement in this country was uncomparable not only to the Soviet Union, but also to the other countries of the socialist bloc, like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. And also the scale of so-called samizdat underground literature published in Poland was also uncomparable to any other country. If you speak about Ukraine, the Ukrainian situation was of course much more complicated, because Ukraine was on the one hand one of the 15 Soviet republics, the republics of the Soviet Union, and that is why of course the direct pressure from the center, from Kremlin, was much higher than in Poland. But on the other hand, Ukraine was something like, let's say, the second nation among or between the equal Soviet nations. And Ukraine, at least partly, could be described as a kind of a privileged republic within the Soviet system. And we should also remember that the present-day borders and social structure of Ukraine is a direct result of Soviet politics, of Soviet geopolitical, economic, social, and politics. And in West Ukraine, like in Lithuania, after the Second World War, there was a strong anti-Soviet nationalist underground. But of course it was repressed till the early 1950s. And what is the kind of paradox that, especially for West Ukraine again, post-war Sovietization was at the same time Ukrainization. It means that, for instance, Lviv, the city where I'm also working, it was of course a Polish city, Polish Jewish city before the war. After the war, it has become Ukrainian city. To a great extent due to Soviet politics. Due to Soviet politics also, this politics could become like a decolonization of Lviv. So on the one hand, Sovietization is Ukrainization. On the other hand, different types of politics that could be described as Russification. Like the reform of Ukrainian language, the idea to promote Russian as a language used especially in, let's say, elitarian circles of culture and society, and so on. And post-Soviet Ukraine, so on the one hand, post-Soviet Ukraine is to a great extent a result of Soviet politics, and on the other hand, post-Soviet Ukraine has deep regional diversities. And also deep regional diversities in terms of the memories of Soviet past. We'll come back to it later. Now Russia. Russian case, as always, is even more complicated because Russian Federation and the Russians, they've had a very special situation in the Soviet Union. What do I mean? I mean that on the one hand, of course, the Russians were kind of a leading nation, or the most important and influential nation. And as I've told before, many politics and initiatives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party were perceived as Russification by the other Soviet republics. But at the same time, the Russians in the Soviet Union were a kind of an imperial nation without their own national flag. That's very important. So, a kind of an imperial nation without their own flag, because the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic was not the Russian National Republic, or the Republic of the Russians. It was a kind of a small Soviet Union within the bigger Soviet Union, if you wish. And as I also told yesterday, there was no something like Russian Communist Party, Russian Academy of Sciences, Russian Encyclopedia. So in Brezhnev time, Ukrainian Soviet Encyclopedia was published, there was no Russian Soviet Encyclopedia, there was only Soviet Encyclopedia, so on. And all these problems with identification of the Russians with the Soviet Union, of course, they've become a very serious challenge for post-Soviet Russia. And we'll see it later in our debate. And so now, keeping in mind this difference in Soviet experience, and this difference in, let's say, different types of remembrance discourses, now I propose you to look briefly at all three countries, and I will start from Poland. I would say that in Poland, the key issue of its transformation, its debate of the communist past, was not the attitude towards the communism or the Polish People's Republic, but the attitude towards the nature of transformation, or the so-called round table, famous round table between the part of communist elites and part of opposition. And also the issue of frustration is very closely related to this issue of the nature of transformation. What do I mean? That in fact already in late 80s and until now in Poland, we have a kind of two camps or two notions inside Polish anti-communist opposition. So the first camp most of all presented by Adam Michnik and Gazeta Wyborcza, the most influential Polish newspaper, could be described as the representatives of the philosophy of negotiation with the communist authorities, the Polish People's Republic authorities, like General Jaruzelski and the rest. And the other group in the last years very strongly associated with brothers Kaczynski and Prawo and Sprawiedliwość political party, is the representatives of the philosophy of confrontation with the communist elites, and let's say of the total liberation of Poland from communism and from previous experiences. And in fact, these two groups are the main, let's say, actors in this debate about the communist past in Poland. There were almost no, let's say, defenders of the communist idea or the Polish People's Republic in the past. The whole discussion is between these two groups of opposition, so to say. And what is interesting, that Michnik is constantly speaking about what he calls anti-communism with Bolshevik face. So in his terms, this another group of opposition, they are, let's say, they're like Bolshevik, they are trying to use Bolshevik methods of struggling for power, but of course using anti-communism slogans. And for him and his supporters, in the very moment of the round table and until now, there was a very serious threat of political chaos in Poland, possibly caused by, let's say, two-principle struggle for total liberation from communist past. And his idea is that the peaceful way out of communism is more important than, let's say, some direct reappraisal of all what was done in the communist Poland. And it's once again his quotation that his aim was peaceful dismantling of dictatorship without revanchism. That's very important. And the other option was quite opposite, like, of course, peaceful dismantling of dictatorship, if possible, is nice, but we do need a serious and principled, not only debate, but also, let's say, a juridical trial of people involved in communist regime, communist crimes, and so on. So, in other terms, the Polish debate about its communist past is mostly not a debate about the general estimation of the communist regime in Poland, but the estimation of the notion of collaboration with it, and also the treatment of former secret service archives. The second issue is closely related to the first one. And that is why the illustration law was adopted in Poland only in 1997. It was not an easy task to adopt it, and in final version, it was the idea that people who are applying for the list of public and state positions, they should declare their collaboration with the secret service of the Communist Party. Just declare. So if someone will sincerely declare this collaboration, he or she will face no sanctions at all, not at all. And we have the example during the last presidential election. There was one candidate, Andriy Portnov, who has declared sincerely that he was a kind of an agent of the Polish secret service. There was no consequences at all for him. The sanctions, they are proposed only to those who will try to hide this fact, to hide the fact of collaboration. That's the first point. And second, that all this illustration law was designed for the people, again, who have secretly collaborated with the regime, but not for the party officials, for the party or state officials of the previous regime. And all the attempts to put people like General Jaruzelski or General Kisiak to trial, they failed. Because there was a kind of a trials, and during the trials, those people who were, of course, responsible for various types of state activities against their position in the communist time, the court decided that there is no clear evidence of their personal involvement in those crimes. So we could say that they escaped any responsibility for it. And so that's the first point about illustration. The second point is about famous Institute for National Remembrance, Institute Pamięci Narodowej. It was created in the year of 1998 And the idea was, again, to promote some ways of dealing with the communist past. And IPN, until now, is one of the key topics in Polish public debate. Once again, those two camps, they have two visions of IPN. So the first vision, presented by Gazeta Wyborcza Michnik, says that first, we should be very accurate with the archives of the former secret services. We should all the time contextualize those documents and not use them in political struggle. And generally speaking, it's better to forget about this complicated past than to use it all the time again in current political debate. And the other option, presented mostly by, once again, brothers Kaczynski, is quite opposite, that we should try our best to find all possible truths about the communist regime and about the collaboration in this regime. And that is why IPN is all the time in the center of this political struggle. And this institution has three very important dimensions. So the first dimension is archival dimension. So the idea was to remove the archives of the SB, the secret police in the communist Poland, to the IPN. And at this moment we have a number of archives in all regions of Poland. Second, it's a kind of a the group of prosecutors, which is designed to, to bring at least some people involved in the crimes of the regime to the trial and to the court. And the efficiency of these prosecutors branch was rather modest, because until now there is only something like 100 rather modest sentences to those people, and none of these sentences is against those, let's say, top officials, like General Jaruzelski and so on. And last but not least, education. Educational programs, including websites. You can also look at them. Sometimes they are really well done. Websites, researchers also included such cases as Jedwabne case, so the murder of the Jews by their Polish neighbors during the war, Ukrainian Polish case, this massacre of the Poles in Volhynia, and so on. And but in terms of political struggle, once again, the issue of archives was a kind of a central issue. And a couple of years ago, to be correct, 4 years ago, IPN has published a book about Lech Walesa experience, let's say, young Lech Walesa experience with the Polish Secret Service, and they tried to portray the first president of Poland as the first democratic president of Poland as a collaborator with the communist regime. It was a huge scandal, topic number one. And until now, this Walesa case is a kind of an extreme example of the usage of the archives of the former communist Polish secret services in current political struggle. What we should stress here, again, that in Poland we have a kind of a consensus about the let's say, non-democratic and unacceptable nature of the communist regime, but we have no consensus about the attitude toward the issues of collaboration with it and the issues of frustration. And that's the main point of public debate. At the same time, we should remember that, contrary to Poland, in Ukraine, or in Russia, or in Belarus, or in all other post-Soviet republics, except, of course, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, there were no attempts to remove archives of the secret services. So until now, all the archives of all the KGB archives, they are kept by the KGB successors in Kiev or in Moscow or in Minsk or everywhere at first. And second, there was no attempt to adopt any type of frustration law. And in Ukrainian political debate, or in Russian political debate, for instance, the very notion of frustration is sometimes used by political marginals, but not by these mainstream politicians. So from this point of view, the difference between Poland and those Soviet republics is very much evident. And of course also the public access to the archives is incomparable, especially in these extreme examples of Poland and Russia. Because in Russia until now, KGB archives, they're almost totally closed for researchers. also for Russian researchers. Okay, now let's move to Ukraine to look how this notion of Soviet past was used in Ukrainian memory wars, if you wish. So, for Ukraine, its post-Soviet development was to a great extent determined by attempts to create a new legitimacy for this state, and at the same time, it's very important, at the same time, to avoid the language, religious, or regional conflicts within Ukraine. And such conflicts, as you probably remember, they were forecasted by the majority of international observers in the early 90s. And it was a kind of a surprise until now, also for Ukrainian analytics, that post-Soviet Ukraine has proved to be rather stable state in terms of on-screen social terms, and not only stable, but also, I would say, repulsive to the violent forms of conflicts. So it's very difficult. There are some examples, but they are incomparable, for instance, for Russian examples. Only some examples of the direct physical violence used in political struggle in Ukraine. It was rather non-violent struggle. That's very interesting. And if you ask ourselves why it was possible, I would say that one of the reasons for this rather non-violent way of dealing with the Soviet past and all the other issues was something that could be described as a salutary or saving pluralism of Ukrainian public sphere. And from the very beginning of independence and until now, official Kiev authorities, Kiev-based authorities, they have approved the existence, they have agreed for the existence of the variety of regional memories and regional remembrance discourses. That means that in Ukraine, once again, contrary to Poland or to Russia or to Lithuania or to almost probably any other post-Soviet state, we could find very regionally diverse models of politics of history. It means that in West Ukraine, or even it would be more correct to speak about former East Galicia, it's like Lviv, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk regions, you will see the massive heroization of this anti-Soviet underground. Anti-Soviet underground during the Second World War and the first post-war years. In the so-called eastern and southern Ukraine, we will see until now the existence of Lenin monuments, of the names of communist officials in the city landscape, and so on. In Kiev, as always, we will see a kind of a coexistence, because in Kiev center, one Lenin monument was removed, but the other is still present here. So it was a kind of a compromise again, a kind of a compromise. So if you wish, you can find different and also competing memories in the city landscape of Ukrainian capital until now, all the time. And probably this deep ambivalence has played a role of a kind of also a kind of a compromise and a kind of a solution for this possible conflict. But despite this ambivalence, despite this regional diversity, I would say that in Ukrainian official politics towards the Soviet past, we could find two main trends. First trend, I would say that the first trend is to stress all the time the unity of Ukrainians everywhere when it's possible. For instance, in Kuchma and Yushchenko presentations of the Second World War, we always have this notion of the unity of all Ukrainians, even if they were fighting on different sides of the front. So the idea is that despite the fact that Ukrainians were on, let's say, on different ideological sides during the war, their general aim was the same: free, independent, democratic Ukraine. It's the quotation from their official statements. So to stress this unity, and of course, in terms of historical reality, there was no unity at all. That's for sure. But in terms of political language and symbolic politics, And that's very important to, let's say, to feel the importance of this notion in all the official representations all the time. And the second trend, also very important, could be described as the attempt to externalize the Soviet experience as much as possible. So to present it as something unnatural, something, let's say, forcibly brought to Ukrainians from abroad, so to say, from Russia. And that is why in school textbooks, in the majority of historical works, communism, as well as the Russian Empire before the communism, they are presented as external powers which forcibly took control over Ukraine. So it was a kind of, you know, so Ukraine was oppressed by the communist regime or by the Russian Empire before it, and the Ukrainians as a group, they are presented as a kind of a collective victim of communism. That's a very important notion, collective victim. And the kind of society totally imprisoned by this system. And of course, the main historical event used to prove this idea is the Great Famine of the Holodomor of 1932-1933. The issue of Holodomor is a very interesting topic in itself. You know, I was given once even a series of lectures about the usage of this. Very briefly, the idea is that already from the beginning of Ukrainian independence, in President Kravchuk and Kuchma times, they were also perfectly aware of the importance of this issue, this event, for, once again, for this externalization of the Soviet experience. But usually this project is ascribed to Yushchenko's politics. In fact, Yushchenko's only novelty in this respect was his very direct stress on the idea that the Holodomor should be acknowledged as a genocide designed against the Ukrainian nation. Of course, we have no time to go in details how it was done and so on, but what is interesting that quite often until now, all the problems of present-day Ukraine, starting from political problems and ending with some, let's say, cultural practices, they are described as the problems of post-genocidal society, the problems caused by this, let's say, deep influence of massive famine, man-made famine on the society. And of course, the idea to promote Holodomor as a kind of an all-Ukrainian victimization discourse was not completely successful. It was not completely successful, but nevertheless, it was rather successful. And also a couple of days ago in Kyiv, there was this annual Holodomor Remembrance Day, and there are already some rituals related to this date, like the candles in the streets and so on. So I would say that this project, the Holodomor project, was probably the most successful project of Ukrainian politics of history in post-Soviet time. And once again, the other issue, extremely important issue of the Soviet experience, of course, is the issue of the Second World War. In this respect, in Ukraine, contrary to Russia, Belarus, we'll see it later, in Ukraine, all attempts to create something like all-Ukrainian narrative of war, they rather failed. They rather failed. So until now, we have this coexistence of competing narratives. Two major narratives could be described as, let's say, post-Soviet or neo-Soviet. It's like this notion of Great Patriotic War, our victory, and so on. The other notion is the notion of the central role of Ukrainian underground, anti-Nazi and anti-Soviet both. And there are also local memories like the Jewish memory. Of course, it's very specific. The Crimean Tatar memory. You should know that the Crimean Tatars, they were deported as a group, the home group from the Crimea in 1944, and they were accused by Stalin in collective betrayal of their motherland, and so on. But nevertheless, mostly we have this competition of two main narratives. And due to this competition, in Ukraine, until now, it's impossible. It's impossible to use, to instrumentalize the topic of the Second World War as a kind of mobilization project for all Ukrainians. So the war remains highly problematic, highly contradictory, I would say, contradictory notion for this country. And that is why I would say that on the one hand, memory issues like the status of Ukrainian nationalistic underground, or the problem of Ukrainian governments of early 20th century destroyed by the Bolshevik aggression and so on, they are used all the time in political struggle as a kind of markers of political difference. So before the elections, we all the time will see this intensification of memory debate. And after the elections, this debate goes down. That's very interesting. So history is used all the time in political struggle, but not to mobilize all the society to some aim, but on the contrary, to divide it into some groups, some political groups. That's very interesting. And probably I will come to an end with Ukraine with one quotation from one Ukrainian journalist, very famous journalist, and this quotation gives us a kind of an understanding of this mainstream interpretation of the Soviet experience of the country. So, his quotation: we need to separate the honor and talent of ordinary people living in the Soviet Ukraine from the ego of the Soviet Empire. So all the issues of responsibility, at least partly responsibility of also of Ukrainians into the creation of the Soviet Empire, they are completely, let's say, they're completely erased. And the next sentence: all Ukrainian in the Soviet system was rather incidental to it. That's a typical quotation. So if someone was or is Ukrainian, then it was incidental to the Soviet system, and vice versa. I would say that you can see the effects of this attitude and new politics in a couple of years, because of course until now in social life we have I would say that the politicians and also the people in active life period, they are mostly until now, of course, the people educated in Soviet Union. And that is why to understand the whole, let's say, impact of this new attitude would be possible only in maybe 10 or 15 years when this new generation can come to active social life. And now we should move to Russia, of course. Because, as I mentioned before, post-Soviet Russia has faced an extremely dramatic problem with the legitimization of its borders, of its post-Soviet borders. And even more with the acceptance of the independence or sovereignty of the former Soviet republics, especially Ukraine and Belarus. At the same time, the threat of the breakup of the Russian Federation in these post-Soviet borders has served as the main explanation and justification for the authoritarian political evolution of the country. We could find plenty of quotations by Putin and other politicians that the only way to preserve Russia in its present-day borders is to strengthen the role of the state, is to strengthen this so-called vertical power, and so on. I would say that paradoxically, in Russian political discourse in the 19th century, you could find exactly the same notions. For instance, Emperor Alexander II is famous for his statement that if we give Russia a constitution, then it will break up. So exactly the same logic is used now to explain why Russia should be authoritarian state. And the central historical event used also in this line, in this campaign, is of course the Great Patriotic War, in its Soviet, mostly Brezhnev time notion. So the notion of the war, which has begun in 1941, of course, not in 1939, and which is ended with a brilliant victory over fascism. And the Great Patriotic War seems to be the only historical event which unites the majority of Russian population at this moment. Of course, keeping in mind that there are also some specific groups, like the Chechen people, who were also deported by Stalin, so for them this memory is a bit different, but they are rather marginal in the general context. And I would say that unconditional choice in favor of the military myth. I would also say kind of a re-Sovietization of the great victory, myth of a strong state and national unity in the face of external enemy was finally taken in 2005. Very important year, 2005. It was the 60th anniversary of victory in the war. And according to the logic approved by the Kremlin, during this anniversary, the winners, so the Russians, they have nothing to apologize for. This is very important, nothing to apologize for. Of course, we should just be proud of our victory. And of course, in this logic, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was no worse than the Munich Agreement, and all this, let's say, the notion of victory is a kind of a key element in this vision of war. What is interesting, that this move to the heroic military version of war and also the Soviet period is sometimes described as a kind of a defensive reply to the initiatives of some post-Soviet states, Ukraine, Estonia, or others, and a kind of, let's say, reply to their nationalistic falsification of the war. So this idea that strong Russian politics should give a reply to this action is very important. And what is important in this case, that Russia gives us a very interesting example of selective, that's very important notion, selective identification with the Soviet. Selective. It means that on the one hand, it could identify itself totally with the heroic events like our victory, and at the same time dissociate itself with the crimes of the Soviet regime, especially of Stalin time, and tend to portray, if we start speaking about the crimes, then we portray the Russians as the main victim of those crimes, in reply to Ukrainian claims that, for instance, Holodomor was a genocide against Ukrainians. And quote you very typical point made by President Medvedev in his letter to Viktor Yushchenko on one of Holodomor anniversaries. It's kind of a very interesting argumentation why this event could not be described as the genocide against Ukrainians. So please listen carefully. Decisions about collectivization of agriculture were taken by the multinational leadership of the USSR and Soviet republics. So here we have this notion of multinational leadership, not of the politics of forcible grain purchase in Soviet Ukraine was conducted mainly by Ukrainians. Also very important. Mainly by Ukrainians. And they not just followed the instructions from the center, but often proposed counter plans of repressions against their brothers Ukrainians. So in other words, the idea is that when we need to identify ourselves with the Soviet victory, then we do it easily, just claiming, as Putin made it once, that Russia will win the war even without other republics. But on the other hand, when we need to, let's say, to start these memory wars with our neighbors, then we could recall them about the multinational leadership of the Soviet Union, about Ukrainians in the Soviet government, and so on. That's very interesting. And I will also briefly mention the other elements of official Russian politics of history. First of all, is the stress on the leading role of the state. Of the state, not of the people, of the society, but of the state. And people, they are supposed to delegate to the state their right of historical choice and initiative. Second, service to the state is more important than the ideological discourse. That's very interesting because according to this point, we could, for instance, proclaim such contradictory figures as Stalin, Stolypin, General Denikin as patriots and true Russians, just because for all of them, Soviet state was more important than their, let's say, ideological disagreements. And we see it all the time also in popular Russian movies, in popular Russian serials on civil war, for instance. And the last point, very important also. In Russia, I would say that we could find the existence of two different versions of memory. Of internal version and external version, let's say export version, designed for the Western audience. And it's interesting that Russia has designed different strategies of presenting itself, for instance, during the Second World War, for the Western Europe and for the Eastern Europe and domestic population, on the other hand. And it's interesting that some countries, some societies, they has moved from one group of these strategies to another. I would say that a couple of years ago, after this Smolensk catastrophe, airplane crash and so on, Poland has at least partly moved from the Eastern European group to the Western European one. And this movement was perceived by many Polish intellectuals, politicians, as a kind of a Russian sincere reconciliation with the past. And you know, as we use this German term, German term, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and so on. But at the same time, we should remember all the time that, for instance, State Duma condemnation of Katyn shootings of Polish officers was presented in a very different way for the Russian publicity and for the Western European publicity, and also Polish. Maybe the last point here would be that if in Ukrainian case we see that the attempt, conscious attempt, to distinguish between the Ukrainians living in Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet regime, to make a clear distinction. In Russian case, the task is even more complicated, because they have to distinguish not only between the people and the regime, but also, attention, between the regime and the state. So even if the regime was bad or repressive or, I don't know how to put it, totalitarian, but the state is a kind of a sacred category preserved in purity for the next generation.